Hello, everybody. My name is Joyce, and I'm a member of the Greater Newburyport Village. We are the sponsoring group for this, the third Wednesday of every month. And just about a 2-minute thing about our organization. We are the Greater Newburyport Village. That's Newburyport plus all the surrounding communities. We have 100+ members. We do have dues, but we have, funds to subsidize for anybody that's an issue. Our main purpose is really to help seniors, like most of you and me, to be as independent and live fulfilling lives as long as we can. And to do that, we provide a lot of volunteer help. A lot of that is rides, handyman services, things like getting your air conditioners in and out, or if you can't, get your giant garbage cans out, or whatever it is. Tech help, if you can't figure out your phone or your TV and so on. There are all kinds of things. In addition, we have a lot of social and educational activities. We have a dinner out at one of the restaurants, any of the various restaurants around town. We have a lot of interest groups, movie group, book group, painting group, writing group, walking group, a lot of groups, which are fun, okay? And in addition to that, we have special trips where we go to museums or go on special guided nature walks. Like, have you ever been on a mushroom walk? It's great. It's great, yeah. So anyway, as I said, the third Wednesday of every month, we sponsor the Village Talk. And next month, our speaker is James Russell, and he's going to be speaking on whaling and the history of whaling in this area. We do thank the Senior Center for providing a space for us, and they've been wonderfully supportive and helpful. And the other thing is that you must turn off your cell phones. And if you, for some reason, have difficulty, then get somebody to help you, okay? I went on the walk that was on the all the signs of the Black History Initiative that are all around town, which are absolutely wonderful. And that was sponsored by the Senior Center last year. And of course, I always am thinking of ideas for talks, and I thought, okay, put him down as an idea for next year, and we got him, so that's great. So Geordie Vining and the Newburyport Black History Initiative, and if you ever do have a chance to go on one of those walks where you're seeing all the signboards and everything, it's really, really great. Okay, so here we go, Geordie.
All right, can everyone hear me in the back? That's good? All right, sometimes I have to hunch over for these microphones, so hopefully that'll work. Let me know if it doesn't. Okay, thank you, Joyce, for that introduction. There's a number of familiar faces. Nice to see those folks in the audience, and it's great to see everyone I don't know as well. I've been working for the city of Newburyport for 23, 24 years. I got hired in 2000, started in January 2001. Kind of amazing how time flies, right? So over the years, I've managed dozens and dozens of projects. I'm essentially a special projects manager to try to enhance the city as a livable place, as a livable community. The Rail Trail project, that's been a backbone of work that I've done over the past quarter century. This building, the Senior Center, was my project, design and construction. Harbor Master Building, the new fire station, a number of renovations of parks and playgrounds throughout the community, the sculptures along the rail trail, mural projects, conservation land out in the common pasture area, public history signage along the rail trail and in parks, and in the downtown and elsewhere. So a whole bunch of different projects. Keeps my life pretty interesting. Newburyport is pretty obviously a very white community, about 91% white according to the statistics we have. But there is a rich black history that up until recently was really largely overlooked, if not pretty much forgotten or ignored. And, I've been to a lot of meetings on this sort of area over the past years, and I definitely see that most residents of this place see themselves as progressive and welcoming, and would like to embrace basically everyone they can who wants to be part of this community. But the city has seen a rise in incidents of hate. And there are definitely some people in our city who do not feel welcome here. You can read about that occasionally in the daily news, about encounters that are unfortunate that happen, or racist graffiti, and that sort of thing. And I have talked to several different generations of black residents in Newburyport, and people do report a number of pretty painful experiences. They experience casual stereotyping, experiencing racism, feeling pretty, the self-description is feeling invisible. I've had friends, white friends, say, there are black people in Newburyport, as if they've never seen anyone but a white face in our town. And then people also saying that, almost paradoxically, they're individually hypervisible because they look a little different than the mainstream folks. So that does impact people's lives and their sense of belonging in this community. And my sense is that the mainstream white community generally appears kind of barely conscious of all this. So, as noted, the black experience in Newburyport over the past few hundred years, previously it's been barely a footnote in the stories that we tell ourselves and on the articles and signs and public-facing city history. This is a city that is overtly proud of its historic preservation, but most of the buildings we find that are associated with black history are actually erased from the landscape, no longer there. So, and this historical erasure, whether it's physical or whether it's the stories that are told, does impact today's attitudes, contemporary attitudes, and a sense of who belongs here. So, with all that said, a number of the stories of black Newburyporters have survived and are there to be discovered and disseminated. So one answer to this has been what we call the Newburyport Black History Initiative. This is the kind of core team that's been working on this initiative for the past few years. Dr. Kabria Baumgartner, she is a Newburyport resident, and she's a professor of history at Northeastern University. That's her in front on the cover of Newburyport magazine. And then Cyd Raschke, who is here, right there, waving her hand. She's also a member of our core team. She's the one who sort of introduced Dr. Baumgartner and me several years ago, and is the connective tissue there. And we've been meeting and working together quite a lot over the past few years. And beyond that core team, that we sort of have concentric rings of people working, other local historians, amateur historians, retired historians, active historians, various representatives of our local black community, and others. The mission of the Black History Initiative: affirm black heritage and belonging in Newburyport, illuminate histories that have largely been overlooked or forgotten, and try to ensure those stories are publicly accessible to a broad audience. The core of the project is these signs, the permanent installation of high-quality interpretive signs in the everyday public landscape of the downtown. And one thing I maybe should have said right up front is at the table right there at the doors, there's a little pile of cards. Joyce is holding them up there. On one side of the card is a little map showing where all of the where each of these signs is located. This map is also on the website for those who want to look at the website. But these cards are a handy way to show people where they are, because I would say a lot of people have seen some of these signs but haven't seen all of them, and don't necessarily know where to look. They're grouped relatively closely together, most of them. So we had, Joyce was talking about the walk we did last fall. I was just talking to Sarah and Mary here about doing another one of these walks sponsored by the Senior Center in June, I think. So we'll have more of those coming up. But these cards are for if you'd like to go explore on your own. That's a handy way to know where they are. So there's 11 of these signs out there in our shared public landscape. And the signs, importantly, they center and they feature stories of Black Americans, Black Newburyporters, domestic servants, mariners, barbers, soldiers, lawyers, activists, and others who lived and worked here from the pre-Revolutionary War era all the way up into the mid-20th century, early 20th century. And early on, Cyd and Kabria and I decided that we were going to focus on, again, the term is centering the voices and stories of Black Newburyporters and Black Americans. Part of Black history is slavery and oppression, Underground Railroad, that kind of thing. And that's obviously very important history, but that's not the only part of Black history. And that is, that frame has been fairly well represented here in Newburyport. But there's a lot more to Black history than those aspects. So that we've been trying to unearth stories, and here's a picture of that card that I was just mentioning, this on the table, showing where the signs are. You know, we chose to put these signs in the downtown core because that really is our shared collective space. To have these signs out sort of further out into the residential neighborhoods, fewer people would see them, fewer people would encounter them. One of the purposes is that just in one's everyday life, you're walking along downtown, there's a sign. And you don't necessarily have to be looking for these in order to see them and get some of the information that they impart. In addition to the signs are the foundation of what we're doing, but we've been trying to extend public awareness with public lectures, like this one, and a number of public events, tours like we were talking about. There's a website on as part of the city's website. That's a QR code that takes one to the website. We've had indoor displays of foam core versions of these signs here in the Senior Center and in other public buildings like the library and City Hall. There's video clips online at the website. Lots of newspaper and magazine articles, and the Old Hill Burying Ground, some burial ground enhancements. This is a picture of one of the events we had in the fall. This is on Pleasant Street at Tracy Square there, and 3 generations of descendants of Louis C. Tyree at the ribbon cutting ceremony for his sign. So you can see the picture of Louis Tyree on the sign there, and these are 3 generations of his descendants from the Boston area who came up to celebrate with us. This is a great event, very meaningful. Well, we'll get into the stories in a little bit after I do this general overview. This is Louis's great-great-great-grandnephew, and he dressed for the occasion, and he is getting ready with those giant scissors to cut the ribbon at the unveiling of the sign. I thought that was wonderful. This is another event that we held more recently in December, and this is down across from City Hall. and right near the Veterans Plaza in Brown Square. And we had lots of members of the Cousins family there joining us. That was another really great event, and we had a lot of people there. And that sign, which is focused on black soldiers and sailors, has a particular emphasis on World War II and the Cousins family, and Frank Cousins' father and Frank Cousins' uncles, who went off to fight. And that was another wonderful day with all these folks. Oh, there's me having another public lecture. That's in the library. Every year at the end of the calendar year, there's the Garrison Week, and there's usually various lectures. So we've been trying to, join in and have lectures associated with these themes then as well. We were talking about the Old Hill Burying Ground. So we had a really terrific ceremony last spring where the Old Hill Burying Ground, basically Glee Woodworth and the rest of us realized that there was a corner of it near Auburn Street which seemed to be an African American section of the cemetery, spanning well over 100 years. And Glee had a hunch that there were other unmarked graves in the vicinity. So with some of our funding, we hired specialists with ground penetrating radar to go in this area, and they located at least 18 unmarked graves in the area. And these are people that we don't have any record of, and we probably never will, but we wanted to be able to honor them and mark those graves. And instead of, as in other places, people are marked as unknown, we're marking them as once known. They were once known by their family, by their friends, by their communities. We don't know who they are, but they were once known. And that was a very special thing, and we all gathered, and collectively we inserted these granite markers into the ground. The project has also won a national award from the American Association for State and Local History. So that was a great bit of recognition, 2024 Leadership Award. There were 47 of these awards around the country, and we were selected to receive this award. I actually went down to Mobile, Alabama to receive this award. So that was really great as well. So I'm about to get to the stories themselves, but we've developed these signs and developed these stories by doing primary research. Primary research versus secondary research. Secondary research is someone has written a book about history, and you read their conclusions and their thoughts. Primary research is when you go to contemporary materials, newspaper articles, people's letters and postcards, the census records, all kinds. We're very fortunate to have the Archival Center at the bottom of the library, and the local historical society, the Museum of Old Newbury, and both those places are full of somewhat hidden information and artifacts. So we went to all these different sources and ended up coming up with 11 different stories, which we made into these signs. And I'm going to just run through and summarize them for you. So this was on one of my tours with some school kids from the River Valley Charter School. Down at the waterfront, black mariners during the Age of Sail. So this is a sign that's down there in the newly expanded waterfront park, and it's actually at the location of what used to be called the City Wharf before all the wharves were filled in. And this location is where an all-black crew launched this ship built in Newburyport called the Montana right after the Civil War. This is what the layout of the sign looks like. All of our signs try to have one primary compelling photograph, image, and a title, and a subtitle, and then a block of text for those who are scholars and want to read every word that we have to say, as well as some other supporting images. Black mariners during the Age of Sail, seafaring, that was one of the main jobs, one of the main occupations for black men all over New England in the 19th century. And sailing was an incredibly dangerous job. Certainly back in these days, the newspapers had regular columns of disasters where they would report every day the disasters that occurred. So a very dangerous job for everybody, but in particular for black sailors, because in addition to all the regular risks, they faced a lot more threats than their white crewmates, especially when they went down to the southern ports. Because before the Civil War, there was something called the Negro Seaman Acts, which all these southern coastal states passed, which basically said that if you're a black sailor and you come into our port, you're going to be incarcerated. While you're there, you're put in jail. They were so frightened of black sailors that black sailors who traveled the world might communicate with the local black population and cause problems. So that was a particularly egregious manifestation of what was going on before the Civil War. And there's also something which is colloquially called the reverse Underground Railroad. Most of us are familiar with the Underground Railroad, where people are helped on their way traveling north out of the South, coming up to the northern United States or to Canada to try to find freedom. There was an equally robust system, although not as well known, called the reverse Underground Railroad, where free black people in the northern areas were captured and taken back down south and sold and enslaved. And they focused particularly on teenagers and children, because those were easier quarry. The numbers varied by port, but I find it remarkable that nearly 1 in 5 American sailors at this time was black. That doesn't necessarily jibe with a lot of people's vision in their minds of who were the sailors at this time. And during the Civil War, nearly 1 in 4 of U.S. Navy sailors was black in 1864. That's a huge percentage. And as noted, some Newburyport ships had all black crews. They had white officers, but they had all black crews. The first sign that we put up was called A Black Neighborhood in Historic Newburyport. This is what really kicked off our partnership a few years ago with this focus on the so-called Guinea Village area of Newburyport. This sign's on the rail trail right near the Low Street Bridge, which the old rail bridge that used to be there some time ago was called the Guinea Bridge. There's a picture of that sign with a map, a 19th century map, sort of showing this general area. And people have been, a lot of people in town, I think, had no idea there was an historic black neighborhood in Newburyport, and that's been very compelling to many folks. In the early 19th century, the census shows there's about 100 black residents living in this so-called Guinea Village, right on the edge of the town near the railroad tracks. The word Guinea, that word carried the stigma of slavery. Guinea was referencing the west coast of Africa, which is the center of the Atlantic slave trade. And so throughout New England, there are communities during this era that are referenced as Guinea, New Guinea, et cetera, because that was an area where black people lived and congregated. We have found evidence of this neighborhood organizing their own annual celebrations called Black Election Day. The people who lived here at this time, they weren't allowed to be part of the political leadership of the community. They would elect their own leaders who would then go and essentially intercede and work with the official leadership of the town on behalf of the community. And we look back in our documents, and these names have faded away, but in addition to the Guinea Bridge, the old place names around here included Guinea Lane and Guinea Hill. This sign is in Brown Square, right across from City Hall, near the statue of our famous son, William Lloyd Garrison, Grant Us Our Liberty, about black abolitionists. Here's a picture of the layout of that sign. And we try to shine a spotlight on the black activists in Newburyport in both the 18th century as well as the 19th century, who were active in filing lawsuits, freedom suits, to against their own enslavers, to free themselves, writing editorials in the local newspapers, writing petitions to the local political leadership as well as the state legislature to end slavery. Cyd Raschke was a Newburyporter who wrote in one of the local papers at the time, before the Civil War, "I need not point out the absurdity of your exertions for liberty while you have slaves in your houses." There's a lot of revolutionary fervor in Newburyport as throughout the colonies at this time, and the revolutionary colonists were characterizing themselves as slaves. In the newspapers, article after article, the revolutionists are saying, "We are slaves to King George. We are slaves to Great Britain. We do not want to be slaves." Cyd Raschke was pointing out, you actually have real slaves in your houses, and you need to grant everybody freedom and to have your rhetoric meet reality, which in Massachusetts, at least, that was a real turning point. And later on, black abolitionists had a strong influence on a young William Lloyd Garrison, who, when he was a young man, he was focused on colonialism, sending black Americans off to another country to have their own land, gradualism. Black abolitionists were not interested in any of those concepts. Black abolitionists were saying, this is our home too, and we need to eliminate slavery now. And he changed his tune with that influence. Another sign, this is down at the corner of the firehouse in downtown Newburyport, right near the pathways going down to the waterfront. This is about the life and travels of Nancy Gardner Prince. Nancy Prince is an incredible person. She was born in Newburyport in 1799. Cyd has said that we're ready for a movie about her life, which, if anyone's got movie connections, listen up. We don't have a picture of her. That's not been able to be located anywhere. But Nancy Prince wrote an autobiography, and it's one of the few surviving autobiographies of a free black woman before the Civil War, which was highly influential at its time. So we know a lot about her through her own voice, which is unusual, because a lot of history at this time is told not through black Newburyporters' individual voices, but through newspaper articles written by white Newburyporters and so forth. So Nancy's father, who was a sailor, had moved to Newburyport from Nantucket, I believe. He died early, unfortunately. And her mother shifted her and her family back to Gloucester to be with her maternal grandfather. But she had a very difficult childhood, was impoverished. The family was really quite scattered. And she eventually met a black sailor, an older man, who she married, who was then recruited to be a black footman for the Russian emperor. Incredible. And so she got on a boat with her husband, and they sailed across the Atlantic, and they lived and they worked for a decade in St. Petersburg, Russia, in the emperor's court. She learned multiple languages. She started businesses there. Her health started failing in those notoriously tough Russian winters, and she came back to the United States, albeit reluctantly. And her husband, unfortunately, died before he could then return. And to help support herself, she gave public lectures, which was also highly unusual for women in this time of society, much less black women, where she would talk about her travels. And she was also, she became famous as an Underground Railroad rescuer. There was a famous incident which was reiterated and reported about for decades after, where she physically led a group of other women and children to manhandle a guy who was trying to steal someone out of Boston, and she ran him out of town rather than let him try to steal this person. She died at age 60 before the Civil War. Amazing person. Fighting for equal school rights. This sign is located across from the old Kelly School, where Melnia Cass attended, the great civil rights activist. It's also, there was a so-called African school located somewhere around in the Frog Pond, Bartlett Mall area. We're not exactly sure where it is, but we found a number of letters and so forth acknowledging it, because back at this time, back in the early 19th century, the black kids in town weren't allowed to be in the town schools, and an African school was started. This is a picture of that sign, this beautiful picture of these kids from, I think that's the early 20th century. So in 1820, 200 years ago, girls from that old historic neighborhood that we were talking about earlier, the Guinea Village neighborhood, they actually brought themselves to school. They said, we want to enroll in public school. And the newspapers report how white Newburyporters were very annoyed by this. And the school committee then voted explicitly to exclude black children from the schools, although their parents had to continue to pay taxes. It took about a generation for that level of prejudice to fade away a little bit in Newburyport, and for kids to be able to be integrated into the community's regular schools. Melnia Cass is a great Boston civil rights leader. She went to school, the Kelly School, as a girl in the early 1900s, and so had a couple of formative years here. And then the great Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, he spoke in Newburyport in 1958, and he predicted, this is a quote from the Newburyport Daily News when he was here, once a generation has gone to school together, work together, live together, prejudice will largely disappear. An optimistic sentiment, which I think sadly has proven not to be true, but something that we all continue to work towards. Black barbers in Newburyport. So this sign is located along the edge of the Green Street parking lot. That strip of green with the oak trees and other trees and grass, there used to be a whole line of shops that were along there. And that sign is in the location of one of those little shops, which is a little barber shop, which is owned by this man, John C.H. Young. That was torn down in the early 20th century. That's a picture of that sign. There's a little map in the lower left-hand corner there, and it outlined in red, those are all barber shops. There's a lot of barber shops, and a lot of them were run by black men, black barbers. Talk about common, seafaring and sailing, that was a very common profession. Barbering was also a very common profession for black men in New England and Newburyport. Some of these barbers, one barber's named Andrew Raymond. In addition to being a barber, he served as president of the Newburyport and Vicinity Anti-Slavery Society before the Civil War. We see his names on petitions to the legislature and going to regional meetings. And we see in the census records in 1870, there were 6 black men practicing professional barbering in downtown Newburyport at the same time. It's a lot of haircutting going on. A generation later, in 1896, there's an article in the Daily News that the white barbershops were refusing service to a visitor who is African American. And after that, some additional black-owned barbershops opened up very explicitly for black residents to be able to get their hair cut and visitors. John C.H. Young, who I was mentioning earlier, we can trace his life through the census records. Something happened. He went from being the head of quite a large family and having his own home on, I think, Johnson Street. He eventually died at the age of 72 in the local poorhouse, the almshouse. And his son-in-laws and daughter and grandchildren, something happened. We don't quite know what. But so he died alone in the almshouse, but his friends then erected a marble gravestone in the Old Hill Burying Ground, which is there to this day, to remember his kindness and selflessness. Something for everyone to go see. It has a beautiful recollection of him written on it, engraved on it. Pictures with Purpose. This sign is in the In Street corridor near the kids' playground there. And that sign is located near, there were multiple photo studios back in the late 19th and earliest 20th century. Americans were crazy for studio photography this time, getting their portraits taken. And this story, there's a picture of that sign. These images on these signs, these are glass plate images which were found in someone's basement or garage and were brought to the archival center. And the former archival librarian, when she heard about our project, said, "I bet you're going to be interested in seeing these." And they're fantastic photographs. And when we looked into these a little bit more, most of these are anonymous folks. We don't know their names. The two on the left, they actually had their names written on the plate. So we were able to find out a little bit about their lives, the Richardsons. One thing that became clear that, while all Americans seem to be very, very much in love with studio photographs, it was particularly important and had a particularly powerful meaning for black Americans, because this was a society, particularly at the time, that had a lot of disparaging public imagery about what it meant to be a black person in America. And but in these portraits, people could control their own image and present themselves as they wanted to be seen by their community, by their friends, by their family. And it was a way to visually counteract these pretty negative mainstream stereotypes. One example, newspaper cartoons, blackface minstrel shows were something that was extremely popular in Newburyport in the 19th and 20th century, which was basically white people with cork on their face, pretending to be exaggerated versions of buffoons. That's a whole other topic for another speech someday. But these pictures had purpose to counteract that. Remembering the women who raised America. This sign is located near the entrance to the Green Street lot, there on Green Street. You can see the old Baptist church peeking up in the corner of that photograph. That sign has a focus on a woman named Caroline C. Cottrell, who lived here 100 years ago, and that was her church. There's a picture of that sign with this photograph that we we got of her through the Museum of Old Newbury. And domestic servants, we've been talking a little bit about some of the common jobs for black men during this time period. Domestic servants that was the common job for black women at this time. So there were hundreds of black and immigrant women who were living and working as domestic servants in the homes of Newburyport's rich families in this era. Their stories are usually glossed right over. They're usually pretty invisible. But around 1900, about 40% of black women in Newburyport, they worked as domestic servants, often living in the homes of their wealthy employers, whether or not they had their own children and their own families. And they worked 12 or 18 hours a day. That's a long work day. And they were on call basically all the time, 7 days a week. And they raised children, and they cleaned, and they cooked. And employers often said their servants were part of the family. In some cases, that seems to be generally true. In other cases, that was clearly a very one-sided opinion. And it is interesting to note that no other members of the family were wearing these high-collared, long-sleeved white uniforms to clearly visually distinguish what your role is in that family. So this sign has a primary profile of this woman, Caroline C. Cottrell, who was born into slavery in North Carolina and then moved up here to Newburyport to work for the Morals for a number of years. She raised Gaydon Morrill, who became mayor of Newburyport in the Great Depression. A landmark within a landmark. So this picture is at the corner of State Street across from the library where that parking lot is. And that parking lot is the location of the former Wolf Tavern Hotel, a grand and beautiful hotel where this fellow Moses Prophet Towns, isn't that a great name? Moses Prophet Towns. I love that. He worked there as a doorman for over 50 years. There's a picture of him on the sign in his double-breasted jacket, and there's a picture of that's what used to be at that corner, that incredible hotel. That hotel, it was knocked down by its owner after the World War II because he wasn't getting enough business, and replaced it with a gas station. Very American thing to do, I guess, at the time. But Moses Prophet Towns, so he was born before the Civil War. He migrated from Virginia to Newburyport in the sort of chaos of the years after the Civil War down south, and the lynchings and terrible economic dislocations. And he worked, as I said, for more than 50 years at the Wolf Tavern. And it turns out that more than half of Newburyport's black residents in this time period, in late 19th century, early 20th century, they were originally from the South. They came up from the South. I think many of us have heard of the Great Migration, the so-called Great Migration, where millions of African Americans came up from the South to the North. And Moses Prophet Towns, he was in sort of the vanguard of that in the late 19th century, a trickle which became a flood of people. He was quite a well-known person around town. There are an extraordinary number of local newspaper articles about him, featuring him, where people are just very interested that they said Moses Prophet Towns had another appointment for his eyes, which have been bothering him. Or Moses Prophet Towns just got back from a trip to see his family down south. When he was older, Moses Prophet Towns fell down on State Street and had to be helped back to the hotel, things like that. It's kind of remarkable. We see him in the 1940 census. It's reported he's 80 years old and he's working 56 hours a week, 52 weeks a year. And he was not paid that much money either. So we located, working with a genealogist, his grandniece, who lives in the Boston area, and I spoke with her on the phone, and She was telling me stories about how she would visit him when she was a girl, she and her cousins. And she ended up by saying, he worked hard, he deserves to be honored with this sign. And so we actually wrote those words on the sign itself. Perseverance in a precarious world. This is on Pleasant Street. You had seen that picture a little earlier of that event that we had in the fall. So this is about Louis Tyree. We chose this location because that brick building right there in the background, that used to be called Griffin Hall. Upstairs there was a big community gathering area. And the newspapers tell us there was a benefit dance held for his benefit to raise money for him because he got hit by a car driven by a millionaire merchant, and he was badly hurt, and he was on crutches, and he couldn't do his job carrying people's baggage and so forth as a porter. And so the community actually rallied around him and held this benefit dance to pay for his medical expenses. That's a picture of him as a young man, about the age he was when he came to Newburyport as a 20-year-old. I think this picture is from 1904. He moved 1,000 miles on his own from Indianapolis to come here, and because his goal is to pursue a higher education. He worked again at the Wolf Tavern as a porter, and he lived there, and he saved his money, and he went to the Newburyport High School, but then he transferred to Phillips Exeter Academy. That was his goal. That's why he came to this region. And he graduated from Phillips Exeter, and then he went on to become the first black graduate of Clark University. And he later attended Harvard and then BU law schools and became an attorney. He found a fair bit of support in Newburyport as an individual person. Again, multiple newspaper articles about him and celebrating him. But it's also pretty clear that the community does not seem like the most hospitable place for black residents in general at this time. So at the same time Louis Tyree is excelling here and working his way towards a higher education and eventually on to attending law school and becoming an attorney. There were local newspaper articles published in 1911 that mocked black attorneys, black judges, and included racial slurs and racist dialect. He probably read that while he was living here. And this is quite a tumult. We live in a tumultuous time right now, but this is quite a tumultuous time in America, particularly right after World War I. And there's this huge national backdrop of so-called race riots and massacres, including in Chicago, where he moved to. Fighting for double victory, Newburyport's black soldiers and sailors. Again, this is the sign that's located near the Veterans Plaza in Brown Square. There's a picture of that sign. This sign focuses on black Newburyport men who fought in the Civil War and in World War II. There's just too much information for all the military conflicts, and we had to focus somewhere. So as noted earlier, we're focusing on the Cousins family in World War II, and then a number of other young men during the Civil War. Double victory, that's a phrase from the World War II era in terms of people fighting abroad and also fighting at home and fighting for double victory against the fascists abroad, fighting for freedom at home. And this is the case in every military conflict since the Revolutionary War and the founding of this country, that black soldiers and sailors fought, and they served a nation that didn't recognize their rights as full citizens. And the hope in every conflict was being able to demonstrate worthiness of equality and citizenship. After the Civil War, again, there was sort of a mixed reception coming home to Newburyport. We can track teenagers who went off to join the cavalry, who galloped into Richmond when Richmond was taken by the Union forces, coming back home to Newburyport, and there's a Newburyport Daily Herald published in 1866, right after the war, this amazingly vicious racist poem about what they consider to be black people's expectations after the war. Something that I would never even want to read aloud because I don't want to leave any of those lasting impressions in anyone's mind. But it is quite striking how ugly that was. And again, the Cousins family, 4 brothers went off to enter military service, joining over 1 million black men and women who fought during the World War II era. This is another picture of that event with Frank Cousins speaking and a Newburyport Police color guard as we unveiled that sign in December. So I'm wrapping up here. This is a quote I found recently from the historian Howard Zinn. He wrote this a quarter century ago, but it seems to speak to our time and to me personally as well. To ward off alienation and gloom, it is only necessary to remember the unremembered heroes of the past and to look around us for the unnoticed heroes of the present. Finally, this is another quote from John Hope Franklin, which I carry with me everywhere I go. Good history is a good foundation for a better present and future. That is my presentation. Let me know if you have any questions. Anyone have any questions?
It was mentioned in one of your panels here about gradualism. Can you explain what that is?
Gradualism was the argument by the white community, even the supportive white community, back to black Americans who are saying, you know, we'll get there eventually. We got to go slow. This was repeated throughout the 19th century, before the Civil War. This was repeated after the Civil War. This was repeated all the way through the Civil Rights Movement. People always being told, you know, slow down, don't ask for so much. We'll do the things gradually because it would be too much of a break, cause too much disruption, too much hardship to change things too quickly. That is difficult to hear generation after generation after generation, because gradualism in practice has meant you never reach anywhere close to the finish line. And so at first, William Lloyd Garrison subscribed to that notion. It seemed to make common sense. We wouldn't want to shake things up too much. The North's economic and the Newburyport's economy was closely tied in to the southern United States, to the slave plantations in West Indies and so forth. So gradualism was something which was attractive to people who didn't want to rock the boat too much.
About the Revolutionary War, when they use the term free blacks,
Yeah.
are the free blacks immigrating from other countries, or were they offspring from slaves? Where's that term?
Yeah, so particularly in the North, but also in the South, there was never a time where absolutely everyone, every black person was enslaved. So even we referenced Nancy Gardner Prince. She was born a free black person in 1799. So in the North, which always had a much smaller black population than the South, there were a number of free black people. Going back to before the Revolutionary War time period, and sometimes their forebears had been freed by their enslavers. Sometimes they had bought their freedom. There's a number of different ways that happened, and but there were always, particularly in the North, a substantial community of free black people. Does that answer your question?
Sort of.
Yeah. The, people are freed by their own volition or by their enslavers, maybe upon their deaths, granting freedom, and then, subsequent generations are able to have a slightly better life. Other questions in the back?
Geordie, I really appreciate the work that you and the Black History Initiative have been doing and will continue to do, I'm sure. Is this material now part of the curriculum in the schools in Newburyport?
That's a great question. We would love to be more engaged with the schools about this. That's something that Cyd and Kabria and I have been talking about recently as we reach an inflection point where we've completed these signs and we're looking for other paths to take the project. I have had some preliminary discussions with a social studies teacher at Newburyport High School who's very interested in bringing this kind of information and perspective to his class and promoting, maybe some of his kids doing this kind of research. So we'd like to meet with the school superintendent and talk about what the possibilities are. The River Valley Charter School has a place-based education program, so their kids are starting to come on tours and to learn about these things from our signs and from a day out in the field. So we would definitely we have a small entree at this point, and we'd like to make that a larger one in the school system.
Yes. Hi. I find this wonderful that we're doing this excavation and sharing it with the community. One of the things that interests me is have you found any research in your research, any evidence of relationships between William Lloyd Garrison and any blacks living here? Friendships?
So,
Any kind of relationship at all?
yeah, and we I guess the two things are he had many relationships with black folks all over the region, and close working relationships and friendships. Our project was not researching that in particular, and that's in part because William Lloyd Garrison was a towering figure, but he hasn't been the focus of our investigations just because we've been trying to focus on the black Newburyporters as opposed to a white Newburyporter like William Lloyd Garrison. So there's probably some more definitive answers out there. I don't have those at my fingertips. But he was certainly, we've found letters, for instance, I was referencing Andrew Raymond, the black barber who was president of this anti-slavery society. There's letters that we found that are going back and forth where some of Garrison's right-hand men were paying his subscription to Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, to make sure that Andrew Raymond had a subscription and had copies of the Liberator newspaper. So Garrison famously, he rode on the train with his black friends and black colleagues. So yes, there's plenty there to unravel. Someone else?
I was just going to ask if there's any intention to ever expand this to address the triangle trade and slavery as it affected Newburyport.
Yeah, so there's a sign in Brown Square on the triangle trade. So when we renovated Brown Square, maybe that's about 15 years ago at this point, and we put up a couple of signs about Garrison, but we also put up a couple of signs about about Brown, Moses Brown, the namesake, and the Garrison Inn, the beautiful old building there, and pointing out that the wealth that created Brown Square and created that building came from the triangle trade. And for those who may not be familiar with that term, the triangle trade is the trade of molasses and sugar being produced in the labor camps, the slave plantations down in the West Indies, down in the Caribbean. And that was a particularly brutal form of human exploitation and oppression, where millions of people died. But taking that slave-produced sugar and molasses and sending it up to areas like Newburyport in the north, where it would be distilled into rum. Molasses was a huge import coming into Newburyport in our custom house and so forth. Distilled by multiple distilleries in rum, and then the ships would take the rum back to Africa, and the rum would be traded, and more enslaved people would be captured, brought back to the West Indies, and this vicious triangle would form. So Glee Woodworth and others have found some evidence of Newburyport ship owners being directly involved with the slave trade. Not everyone was involved with sort of all legs of the triangle, but that was a very significant part of the northern economy. And it is something which is fairly invisible to a lot of Newburyporters. We look at all these beautiful captains' houses and buildings along High Street and so forth. Where did all that wealth come from? As if it was some bloodless enterprise. No, that wealth was built on the slave-produced products from the West Indies, and that's an important part of our history. So we do have one sign which tries to point that out to people. Anyone else?
Just point out, when you talk about the number of barbers in Newburyport, they not only cut hair, but they also served an important health function. They did dental extractions, minor surgery.
Yeah.
So they performed vital community services.
Yeah, most definitely. And it's a profession which it was one way for black men of this era to not have to do backbreaking manual labor, which was what a lot of the rest of their friends and family were doing. And there was something, some interesting dynamic where white men liked being served by black barbers, liked having their hair cut by black barbers. And in Newburyport, where you had a very small black population, the black barbers that was their job. They had to cut white men's hair and do some of these other things because they couldn't survive economically otherwise. So a lot of different layers to that profession.
Thank you for your work on this wonderful project, and thank you for a wonderful presentation.
All right, thank you, everybody. Thank you.